Hello and welcome to the Conversation Cabinet. I'm Ethan Pearman.
And I'm Josh Reams.
And today we have Iain Dale, author and LBC host. How are you doing today?
Hello. Good, thank you.
Where are you joining us from today, Ian?
I am in my office in Tunbridge Wells.
Oh, very nice.
Ooh.
Speaking of Tunbridge Wells, to go straight into things, didn't you run for election there?
You want to go there first of all, do you? The answer is yes and no, in that I decided when the local MP, Greg Clark, announced he was standing down, it never occurred to me to do it because I thought I'd got that out of my system. And then I got a WhatsApp message saying that I was the talk of the Tunbridge Wells WhatsApp groups. And I said, why?
Wow.
And they said, because they all want you to stand to replace Greg. So I thought, no, it's ridiculous. But then the thought sort of kept going around my head and thinking, well, actually, why not? I've got a national profile. I've lived locally for, at that point, it was 25 years. So to cut a very long story short, I decided to do it. And then the following Tuesday, I announced I was quitting my LBC show to run in this election. And then the next morning, the guy who would have been my campaign manager rang me up and he said, we've just had an email from the local Lib Dems and they've got this recording of you on your For the Many podcast saying that you don't like living in Tunbridge Wells. I mean, I immediately thought, oh dear. And I knew that I'd said a lot of things. I knew that I'd said a lot of things that were sort of critical of the Conservative government, but I thought, well, I can explain all of those ways. It's my job to be analytical. But I hadn't remembered this. And I looked up when it was, and it was about 2.5 years previously. And it was on a week when all of the roads were being dug up and it made me late for a hospital appointment. A friend of mine had been mugged in the centre of Tunbridge Wells. So I wasn't feeling particularly benevolent towards the place. And
Yeah,
I defy anybody who's lived somewhere for 25 years to just think it's the most marvellous place and there's nothing wrong with it at all. But you don't have context in politics, and I could see it plastered all over Lib Dem leaflets. So I thought, well, I'm not going to suffer death by 1,000 cuts. I thought I won't actually put my name forward. So I rang up the Conservative Party headquarters and said, take my name off the list, please. So it was a 24-hour campaign, which must rate as one of the shortest in political history.
Well, that's still quite the achievement.
Could you talk to us about your early media career? Because you kind of started broadcasting in the early 2000s when LBC was pretty much starting out, I think. Could you talk about how that went? What was it like? Was there any setbacks at the start, or how did that kind of go for you?
Well, I got into it very late. When I started at LBC, my first show was in 2009, and then they took me on sort of permanently into September 2010. And I'd always had two ambitions in life. One was to be a radio presenter, and the other was to be an MP. So at least I fulfilled 50% of my ambition, and I had a go at the other one. But I'd been around the media quite a bit before then. And I suppose, my first appearance on the media was on Radio 1 when I was 18, I think. And Mike Reid was presenting the breakfast show, and he used to do a feature called Beat the Jock. And Mike, I don't know if you've ever heard of Mike Reid, but I mean, he was a really famous DJ back in this the very early 1980s. And he had an encyclopedic brain. He was one of the people behind the Guinness Book of Hit Singles. And so you had to basically ask Mike Reid a question, and then he would try to answer it. And if he couldn't answer it, you've got a Beat the Jock mug. So that was my first appearance on radio. And then I was on Question Time as a member of the audience in 1986. And someone at the BBC found the clip of it the other day, and it's hilarious. It was just after the Americans had bombed Libya. And I looked like you two. That's like your I was a bit older than you, but I looked so young, and my voice was so posh. It was unbelievable. But I'd done a lot of punditry. On Sky and the BBC from about 1998 onwards. And I'd done some presenting on 5 Live, a political program called Sunday Service, alongside Fee Glover and Charlie Whelan. And that was, I thought, my breakthrough opportunity, because it went really well. Everyone seemed to like what I was doing, but nobody came knocking at my door. So I kind of gave up on radio after that. I would still appear on things doing political commentary, but that was about all. And then in 2009, my friend Yasmin Alibi Brown rang me up and said that she'd got an audition at LBC. And I'd been on LBC. I think it was actually my first serious program in 1998, 99 with Giles Brandreth. But and I always thought, why haven't they asked me to present? But of course, what I now know is I should have gone knocking on their door and actually made it clear that's what I wanted to do. It may still not have worked, but if you're sort of shy and retiring, it's never going to work. You have to, if you don't promote yourself, this is a lesson in life, I think, nobody else is going to do it for you. So I ended up doing an audition with Yasmin, but it was a disaster. She's a brilliant
Why is that?
commentator, but she found all of the radio bits sort of a bit of a challenge, sort of going up to the news, teasing to the next hour, all that sort of thing. So I thought I would never hear from them again. And then 3 weeks later, they invited me to do their evening show because their presenter was ill. And the rest is history. But I mean, I said, "Oh, is it with Yasmin?" And they said, "No, just you," which made it slightly awkward. But she's still a very good friend and appears on my program. So that's how it all got started, really. But I was 48 at the time, so it just shows that if you've got a dream, I mean, don't give up on it. Not everything happens straight away in life.
Well, hopefully we can get onto the radio in less than 48 years, but we'll see. But you clearly have quite a stake in the media, I think it's fair to say. Do you have some kind of sense of responsibility that you feel? Like a lot of people, they'll see one clip or listen to the radio one time and that will shape a lot of their political views. Do you feel some kind of responsibility for that?
Yes, I mean, that is one of the difficulties of the modern media, where that, I mean, I do a 3-hour show. Well, clearly, very few people, even if they're listening live on the radio, are going to listen to the whole 3 hours, depending on what show you're presenting. And at the breakfast show, for example, which Nick Ferrari does, the average length of listening time there is around 20 to 25 minutes because people are getting up, they're making breakfast, and then they go to work.
Course, yeah.
I mean, my average listen is a lot longer than that, but it's still, I don't know what the percentage is that do listen for the whole 3 hours. If you start watching or listening to Cross Question, which I do at 8 o'clock Monday to Wednesday, which is like our version of Any Questions, you probably watch that or listen to that whole hour and if you can catch people at the beginning, and that's where the opening monologue in an hour is really important. You've got to get people. And there is a responsibility because I don't want to be known as a shock jock. I'm sure there are times when I say very controversial things, but I'm not doing it so our digital people can put out clips that they want to go viral. But that's their job. And so they will pick out a 30-second or a minute-long clip of something I've said that is a bit controversial, and then they will headline it to make it even more controversial. And sometimes they get it very, very wrong. I mean, sometimes they headline it saying that I've said something which is the opposite of what I've said. So the modern day, and I get that. That is, if you're going to attract new listeners in, you've kind of, without being too shock jockey, you've got to give some punchy views. You can't have a 10-minute monologue. Well, you can. I mean, James O'Brien does long monologues, but again, they will clip little bits from that. It is a frustration for me because if you gave me a choice of would you like these short clips or not, I would say not. But I completely understand in the modern day environment why you have to do it, and some of them can get millions of views.
It's kind of a shame that that's what it takes to get people to engage in relevant issues. That you have to almost polarize things that you've said in the media, especially on platforms like TikTok. You take a very short clip and it has to be very controversial, and those are the ones that do the best. And then you just get to a very polarized demographic of people.
No, that is absolutely.
Which I think is a shame.
Right. I'm not sure that's ever going to change. So, I mean, you can rail against it as much as you like. I mean, we've got the advantage in that all of the presenters on LBC are encouraged to be opinionated and to give their own opinions. And this is where some people who come from the BBC find it quite a challenge because it's been drummed into them not to offer an opinion. And some just can't adapt to that. I mean, Sheila Fogarty is an interesting example because she joined us, I think 2013, 2014, sometime around then. And if she was here now, she would tell you that it probably took her about 2 years to really get what was expected of her at LBC. And now you can't stop her. I mean, she's opinion central. It's there is a temptation, because you know you are judged now not just by the audience that you attract to listen to the program, but you're judged by the number of people that watch your program as well. You're judged by the number of social media hits that you get. And so the temptation is to be a slightly extreme version of yourself. So you hold a view, but you exaggerate it by 10 or 20% just to get those clicks. Now, I like to think that I don't do that, but I'm sure I do. I'm sure subconsciously I do from time to time. The other temptation is to go all in. So, for example, when October the 7th happened in Israel, I made a decision right from the beginning. I was going to row in totally behind Israel. And I don't regret that at all. I think that was the right thing to do. But over the course of the last, nearly 2 years now, I haven't backtracked on my support for Israel, but certainly don't support the Israeli government and what they've done to a large extent. But of course, once people have got it in their minds that you are maybe the strongest supporter of Israel on the British media, whatever you say in the future, they don't take any notice of. So, for example, when I interviewed the Israeli ambassador and really gave her quite a hard time over what they were doing in Gaza and saying it's not targeted bombing.
Rightfully so.
You just have to look at the scenes that you can see it isn't targeted. Nobody really took, it did get a lot of attention, but nobody thought, oh, that's interesting. Iain Dale's become slightly more nuanced on this. And I'm thinking, no, I'm just doing my job. I've got somebody in front of me who represents the Israeli government, so I'm doing my job in questioning her. And when I threw, possibly an exaggeration, when I terminated an interview with Natasha Hausdorff, who's from the UK Lawyers for Israel, because she repeatedly accused me and another guest of lying, again, I then got it in the neck from Israeli supporters. So I went from being the most pro-Israel presenter on British radio to a Hamas lover overnight.
It just seems like you can't please anyone.
No, you can't. And that's exactly the right conclusion to draw. Because if you do try to be friends with everybody and try and get everybody to like you, you're not going to succeed. You've got to accept that there will always be people out there, no matter how logical you think your argument is, there will always be people who want to pour a bucket of shit over you.
I think it's kind of hopeful in a way, because if as bleak as it is, at least you know you can be authentic, and you just know you can't please anyone, but it's more of a reason to be authentic because there's no point trying to people please. So I think that's kind of the beauty of it in a way.
I think that's true. I do a lot of my program is not political. For example, in the 9 o'clock hour, generally we don't do a political subject, because when Ben Kentish takes over at 10, he will then cover whatever the big story of the day is. So I do a lot of emotional subjects, and which is something I didn't anticipate when I joined LBC. But I like doing mental health phone-ins, grief, depression, whatever. What's it like to live with an alcoholic? One of the most challenging ones I ever did was sort of male-on-male rape, which nobody ever talks about because they don't think it's a thing. Well, it is a big thing. And my producers, who are about your age, they said, oh, you can't do that. Nobody will phone in. I said, oh, you just watch. And within 5 minutes, we had a full switchboard of calls. In fact, I think we extended it to 2 hours because it's unbelievable. And the thing is, with things like that, you don't need dozens of calls. You need 4 or 5 that have got a really good story to tell. And if you're phoning up to talk about depression or alcoholism or gambling addiction, you've got a story to tell. And I know that as the presenter. So my job is to tease things out of them, the listeners, and to encourage them to say things that they may have never told anyone else. And that's, I think, one of the great things about radio. It's such an intimate medium, much more than television. And people have told me things that they've never told any member of their family or even their best friend. I remember, one example I always quote is a woman called Anne in Enfield, and she rang we were doing a phone-in on rape, I think, and she phoned in and she said, Iain, I've never told anyone this before, but a few years ago, I was raped at a family wedding by a family member. I was thinking, oh my God.
Oh my
God. And then she said, and it wasn't a normal rape. And of course, the natural response to that is, oh, what do you mean by that? But as soon as the words came out of my mouth, I thought, oh, not sure I should have asked that.
Yeah.
And then she
Yeah.
said, well, let's put it this way. It wasn't up the vagina. And I was thinking, and this is just before 9 o'clock. And I was thinking, oh, should I dump that? Because we have a dump button if somebody says something, if they swear or whatever. Anyway, I don't think we did. And she poured her heart out to me, and she said she'd never told her husband. Anyway, the next night we were talking about something completely different, and she rings in again and says to my producer, I want to talk to Iain again. And the producer says, well, you can't really, because we're talking about HS2. And she said, no, I really want to. Anyway, so Laura, my producer, just said in my ear, look, we've got Anne on again. What should we do? So I said, well, put her on right at the end of the hour. So she comes on and she says, Iain, I told my husband last night. And I was thinking, oh my God, what have I done? And she said, I feel I can see the blue sky again. And he had apparently been completely understanding. And I thought, well, thank God for that. Because I mean, that could have gone seriously wrong. But I remember having a discussion afterwards with my boss saying, why do you think that these people, because it wasn't the first time this sort of thing had happened, why do you think they tell me things that they haven't told anybody else? And he said, because you've got a calm manner, you're not threatening, you don't interrupt, you don't sort of row with people generally. So they trust you. You're the friend that they've never met. And if you think about it, if you listen to a radio program, literally 4 or 5 nights a week, you get to know the presenter. And my partner always says, can you keep nothing private? Like if I meet someone in the street and they recognize me, they know that I drive an Audi. They know that I support West Ham. They know I've got 2 dogs, etc., etc. And that builds that connection between the presenter and the listener. And you can't get that on television, I don't think.
Well, I think nowhere near to the same extent. But I think that's really beautiful to be able to have that kind of connection with people. But I think with politicians, it might be slightly different. Is there kind of, I mean, I personally loved your interview with Zach Polanski. It was so hilariously awkward. But similarly to that, is there kind of any memorable or difficult interviews that you have that just string to your mind?
I mean, again, in interview, I'm often accused of being, I'm often accused of being a soft interviewer because I don't shout at people generally. If a politician lies
once you
to
shout,
me,
you lose control a little bit.
Yeah, if a politician lies to me or is trying to pull the wool over my eyes or just coming out with the spin that they've been told to do, I can mix it with the best of them. And there have been examples where I have had some fairly robust exchanges with politicians, but I never go into an interview thinking, how can I trip you up? Because that makes it all about me. And I'm not there to look good. I'm there to elicit information from a politician and get them to explain why they're doing something or not doing something. And generally, everyone respects that is what you're there to do. So I sort of I don't really have role models, but I'm much more David Frost, who you probably have you heard of David Frost? So I come out with these names, and I'm thinking, well, I mean, he used to effectively do the Sunday morning BBC show. Brilliant interviewer, but very, very slowly catchy monkey. And he would get loads of news lines out of his interviews, being really polite, but asking difficult questions, but not in an aggressive way. And I think the aggressive interview is so outdated now. And the internet and podcasts in particular have allowed us all to do much longer form interviews. So I do a podcast called Iain Dale All Talk, which is interview based. And there's no finish time on it. I mean, generally they're 45 to 60 minutes, but I did one with Neil Kinnock, which lasted 2 hours.
We had Neil Kinnock on as well.
Yeah,
we had him on as well.
How long did you have him on for?
Just under
over
an hour,
I think.
Oh, was it over? Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I think it was sitting around an hour.
Yeah, we had a couple of technical difficulties, but yeah, we had him on.
Yeah, I think.
And it was brilliant. I didn't intend it to be 2 hours, and it wasn't because he was living up to his reputation as a Welsh windbag. He was just fascinating. I'm sure you found the same.
No, it was really inspiring.
Incredibly fascinating. Yeah.
But that's the constraint of radio, and more so on television, where if you're presenting a breakfast show or a drive time show, it has to be pacey. Whereas at the evening show, you've got a little bit more time to let things breathe. So I can do an hour with somebody. I mean, we do generally take phone calls, so do half an hour interview, then half an hour phone calls. But you can't do that on a breakfast show, or indeed on virtually any TV political show. And I think that's a real shame.
No, I think podcasts are a lot more, obviously you're quite biased, but they're a lot more expressive, I think. There's no time constraint, as you said. You can really indulge yourself in the issues and the discussions. I think that's really important, because I don't think we have enough of that, especially amongst young people, these really important discussions happening thoroughly, especially in university as well. I think that's changed a lot.
Yeah, you're at difficult interviews, and I didn't give you actual examples.
Yeah. No, please don't worry.
I've never ended an interview with a politician, I don't think. I have probably increasingly, I'm doing that with callers, not through any intention of doing it. But if somebody comes on the radio and starts uttering utter bullshit, and it's either they've got things from conspiracy websites, or they're Russian apologists, or I mean, I have very little patience for that nowadays.
I've seen you react to a couple and you just look so disappointed.
But you have to respect the fact that people have phoned in to give their views. They've been put on air. I don't select who goes on the air. The producer does that. But sometimes you have to reflect what you think your audience is thinking. And there are people who, I mean, I try not to take the piss out of people too much. I mean, there are you do sometimes get a very thick person ringing in. And the worst thing you can do then is sort of ridicule them in a way that they don't realise that they're being ridiculed, but the rest of the audience does.
They believe what they're saying.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And they can assert as fact something which you know is not a fact, and you can argue till you're blue in the face that you're right and they're wrong, but they just won't accept it. I mean, that can be quite fun sometimes. And there are callers who you can have a little bit of fun with, but you've got to judge it right.
Of course.
And you've got to sort of, I mean, bear in mind, if a young person rings in and says something really that I think is really naive, I mean, it's not a good look for a 63-year-old to belittle an 18-year-old. It just isn't.
Of course, yeah.
You have to bear in mind, female callers, that there are limits to the level of banter you can nowadays have with a female caller. But there are some magical moments too when people enter into the spirit of it. But I'm slightly avoiding your question about sort of difficult. I mean, I think the interview that I'll probably have etched on my gravestone, I mean, it was difficult, but it was brilliant in another way, was with Theresa May when she was Prime Minister.
Yeah.
She is not the easiest person to interview because she does resort to robot mode quite a lot. And it was in 2017, she was going through all of the Brexit negotiations. It wasn't going well. She had just had a terrible conference speech where, like me, she had a cough, and in the end couldn't really make herself heard because of the cough. Somebody handed her a P45 during the middle of the speech. The conference backdrop fell down. And I thought she would cancel the phone-in because it was the next week. But she didn't. She came in. And she's not a natural phone-in person. But she did really well. First couple of calls, handled them well. And then an Italian lady phoned in to ask about EU citizens' rights. And instead of being empathetic, she gave a really unempathetic answer. So I then intervened and sort of tried to drag a bit more out of her. And I ended up asking her, well, Prime Minister, you voted Remain, but you're leading a Leave government. If there was a second referendum, which a lot of people seem to want, how would you vote? And she said, tried to laugh it off first of all, say it's a hypothetical question. I don't answer hypothetical questions. I said, well, it isn't really, is it? Because there's a growing movement for a second referendum. And it went on. And the second time, well, I remember I then asked her, well, I asked this to Jeremy Hunt, was he Foreign Secretary then? I think he was, or Health Secretary, at the conference last week. And he said he'd voted Remain, but would now vote Leave. Prime Minister, if Jeremy Hunt can tell me that, why can't you? And I did it in a perfectly calm, rational way.
Yeah.
And I could see the look of utter terror in her eyes. And it sort of descended from there, really.
So much power as a presenter.
Oh, my word.
That became, Andrew Neil called it the Iain Dale question, which I was so proud of because he was my hero in terms of interviewers.
Really? Oh,
and it was
amazing.
Repeated every half an hour on Sky News for the next 24 hours, and it became a real thing. And then her press guy Robbie Gibb, rang me later that night and ranted down the phone to me. You shouldn't have asked that. I said, why shouldn't I have asked that? Perfectly normal question to ask, I would have thought.
So it's your job. It's your job to do that.
You planned it all. You planned to trip her up. No, I didn't. I didn't have any producer saying anything in my ear. I didn't have a list of questions in front of me. I asked the very question, Robbie, that Andrew Neil would have asked when you were his producer on the Daily Politics, and you would have been in his ear saying, go on, push her, push her. And in the end, you had to admit that I was absolutely right. So that's probably that, and the Boris Johnson interview, which I actually didn't even know was going out live on Sky and the BBC in the hustings in the 2019 Tory leadership campaign. And the previous night, he and Carrie had a row. He'd spilt wine on their white sofa, and the neighbours recorded it, as you would, and then sent it to The Guardian, as you would. The police were called.
Fantastic.
And so it was
Police?
the first, yeah. So the neighbours called the police, and I think they turned up. So the next day, I had to host the first hustings between Jeremy Hunt and Boris Johnson in Birmingham. And I remember saying to Boris Johnson on the way up to Birmingham, I said to Brandon Lewis, who was the party chairman, I said, you do know I'm going to have to ask him about this. And Brandon just said, well, it's your job. You do what you want. Anyway, Boris comes up to me in the green room. He goes, oh, you're not going to ask about this newspaper stuff, are you? And I said, well, I've got to, really, haven't I? I said, I'm not going to labour the point, but I have to ask it. And I assumed he would therefore address it in his speech before the question and answer session, but he didn't. So he sat down, and I said to him, well, Boris, before we start on all why you should or should not be leader, let's talk about what happened last night. What's your version of events? Well, Iain, I don't think people want to hear about that. I think they want to hear what I'm going to do for the country and how I'm going to change the economy. And I said, no, I don't think they do today. I think they want to hear what your version of those events are. And he then sort of went on about something else. So I went back a third time and I said, no, it's perfectly reasonable to ask you a question which is about your character. And I mean, on the way up to Birmingham, I'd actually texted like Andrew Neil, Andrew Marr, Nick Robinson, all sorts of people saying, how do you think I should handle this? And so I knew there was a lot of pressure on me to do it properly. And I think I asked him 5 times. And by the final time, the audience was booing. Now, at the time, I thought they were booing me, but I think some of them were actually booing him for not answering the question. And he started talking about red buses, which is quite a talent when you come to think of it.
To go from
I've always found with Boris that he's one of the most difficult people to interview because he never looks you in the eye. He'll be looking all around the studio rather than at you because he knows it's more difficult for you to interrupt him. And look, I wasn't sure if I'd handled it correctly, but when I switched on my phone about an hour later, I had about 200 messages and all these like first-rate interviewers saying, "Oh, that was brilliant! You did it absolutely perfectly. Well done." And because I'm not a trained broadcaster, I'm not a trained interviewer, I'm not a trained journalist, I've always had this sort of imposter syndrome. So I kind of need to be validated that I have actually done something well. I think that I've got rid of that now.
It's a lot of pressure. It's a lot of pressure to always act as like the mouthpiece of the people and ask these really important questions.
But I've found over the years that the interviews that go best are the ones that I've done virtually no preparation for, which I know it's not something I should suggest that you two do. Everybody works differently. I remember one day I got caught up in a traffic jam and I arrived at the studio 30 seconds before we went on air. And I just sat down, gathered my thoughts. And then, I mean, nobody would have known, as it turned out, that I literally had been running to the studio, was almost late. And I just and that was one of the best programs I've ever done because the adrenaline was flowing. People say, well, how can you justify not preparing? Are you very lazy? I said, no, I'm not lazy. The last 40 years of my life have been the preparation for what I do now. And that's why I think it's very difficult for younger presenters to maybe have the depth of political knowledge that you need to do a program like mine. Because if you're in your 20s or early 30s, I mean, if you're doing an emotional phone, you haven't got the life experience. Whatever subject there is, I can generally relate some personal experience to it. Now, I mean, you can't if you're an alcoholic or if you're doing something on alcoholism. I don't drink, so I've never been an alcoholic. I've never lived with an alcoholic. But you sort of learn how to handle those things. But a lot of other things, you have to give your own experiences, and that encourages others to do so. And on the political side, you remember, oh, in 2003, this happened, which is completely relevant today. I mean, I do this podcast called Where Politics Meets History. There's very few political events that happen nowadays that haven't happened in some form, in some shape or form before. And again, if you haven't lived through those times, I mean, it's like if you were to host a discussion now on the Iraq War, you would probably think you'd have to do a lot of, because I suspect you weren't even alive when the Iraq War happened,
No.
but you would have to do quite a lot of
exactly.
research on that, whereas I lived through it.
Yeah, slightly similar to your Boris Johnson moment. Today in the news, it's all about the cabinet reshuffle with Angela Rayner, David Lammy, and Yvette Cooper. Firstly, can I just get a little bit of not your opinion, but what you're thinking on that at the moment, your first thoughts? But then also, as a presenter, how you prepare yourself to be discussing those questions through phone calls, and then also maybe through interviews in the future.
I think the whole Angela Rayner situation is tragic in many ways, and I genuinely feel sorry for her. And again, I said that on Twitter last night. Well, you can imagine what the response was to that. I mean, I don't agree with any of her, virtually anything that she's done in policy terms, but she is somebody who knows how to get things done. She knows how to pull the levers of government, which so many cabinet ministers don't seem to. So I think from that point of view, she's a loss to the government. She's a very different kind of personality to most politicians, which again, I think is refreshing. She's somebody that everybody knows, whereas most of the cabinet, and this is the same for the previous cabinets, most people don't know any of them because they've made no impact. And I think we do need to have more characters in politics, and she's certainly a character.
Yeah.
So from that point
I mean,
of
a
view,
lot of people have. Sorry, on.
well, a
I
lot
was
of
going to say,
people.
sorry.
You go.
It's certainly a shame because I think a lot of people, no matter where they are on the political spectrum, can recognise that she's had a very inspiring journey into politics. You know, dropping out of school and growing up, in a quite poor area, and it's just, I think it's a lot. She's the kind of figure that a lot of people would like to see, that kind of politician. So I think, despite obviously her doing wrong, it's a shame.
This is why I think some of the commentary has been, oh, well, people have had it in for her because of her background. But I'm thinking, hang on a minute. She got to be Deputy Prime Minister, partly, I would say, because of her background in a sense, partly despite it. So she's a perfect example, I think Keir Starmer said this, of social mobility. And it shows that anybody in this country can get to the top of politics, given a few breaks along the way. And she got to be Deputy Prime Minister on merit, I think. But yes, of course, a lot of the right-wing newspapers have been attacking it, but they would have attacked anyone in that situation. Now, she's kind of the architect of her own downfall because she didn't take the advice to get proper tax advice from an accountant. Now that was partly her downfall. The second reason she fell was because she was very holier than thou in opposition about financial affairs. I mean, quite rightly. I mean, saying, well, we're going to be different from the Tories, financial probity and all the rest of it. Well, if you go for the opposition politicians on that, don't be surprised if they come for you when you hit a bit of difficulty.
Yeah.
I mean, I personally don't think that this transgression, it was serious enough really to warrant her to resign. But if you break the ministerial code, I'm sorry, but that is what happens. So I don't think she was singled out as such. I think she's known all along that she will be judged by different standards to other people, maybe. That maybe shouldn't be the case. But you see, I'll give you an example here. When I stood for Parliament in 2005, I was the first candidate to be selected, having told the selection committee that I was gay. Now, when you're the first to do anything, you become a person of notoriety. So I knew that I would be scrutinized. I mean, it's a bit like when Margaret Thatcher, I'm not comparing myself to Margaret Thatcher, but it's a bit like when she first became the first woman leader of a political party and then the first woman prime minister. She knew that she had to be better than anyone else, better than the men, Otherwise, she would be judged to be a failure. Now, back in 2003, there weren't many out politicians, and there were several who people thought were gay, and they would have this sort of retinue, sort of young, good-looking men working for them in their offices. People like the two of you, and that's a compliment, by the way.
Thank you.
And I decided, and there were always sort of rumours about, well, why are they employing these young, good-looking men? Off, nudge, nudge, wink, 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 and it was all the sort of Westminster gossip rumour. So I decided that if I was elected, I would only employ women in my office, so nobody could accuse me of doing anything sort of that wasn't appropriate.
It's a shame you had to think that way, though.
It's absolutely appalling that you have to think that way, but I still think that goes on a lot. My campaign assistant was furious because he was 23, and he sort of thought, well, if you win, I want to be your assistant in Parliament. I said, well, I'm sorry, you're not going to be. I mean, that's just the way things are, I'm afraid. And you are judged to different standards to other people. It's not fair, it's not right, but it just is.
It's interesting you talk about that experience. We had a guest on, Michael Fabricant, who's obviously openly gay, also conservative, and he's found that very hard as well. But would you say that's gotten better in recent years with more inclusivity and pride?
Well, I remember shortly after I was selected, I was at the Conservative Party conference in Blackpool, and this guy came up to me, I know he's in his early 20s, never met him before, and he just stopped me in the corridor and said, I just want to thank you. I said, what for? And he said, because you've made it easier for us. And I thought, well, if I never achieve anything in politics, I'm in a sense quite happy to have done that, made it easier for other people. And I think it wasn't just me. I mean, there were plenty of others at the time who then did get selected, having come out. And at the moment, you could argue that gay people are overrepresented in Parliament. I mean, there's about, I think, between 65 and 70 gay MPs now. So 10, 12% of MPs are gay. Now, nobody's ever been able to conclude exactly what percentage of the population are, but I don't think it would necessarily be that high. So it's kind of, I think we've come a long way on minority issues in politics. You look at the proportion of women MPs now, you look at the proportion of ethnic minority MPs, the fact that we now have an ethnic minority Home Secretary, that under Boris Johnson, there were, I think, was it 7 or 8 people from ethnic minorities in his cabinet? So literally a third of the cabinet were not white. He got no credit for that whatsoever. And he didn't promote them because they weren't white. They just happened to be. They just happened to be generally, not all, generally talented people who made it on their own merits. And that, again, so when we decry our politics, we sometimes need to look at what has been achieved over the last 20 years on this kind of issue.
I'm slightly changing subject here. We had an interview yesterday with someone who had one of your books, and I just found that quite funny. And I'm just quite intrigued about your decision for your own writing.
It was a funny coincidence.
We already knew we were going to interview you, and he said, "Oh yeah, I love this book by Iain Dale." I was like, "Oh my, we're interviewing him tomorrow."
Which one?
I'm just quite intrigued.
I think it was your one on Margaret Thatcher.
Was it? Oh, was it?
I think it was one on Margaret Thatcher.
Get your story straight.
Yeah. I'm just quite intrigued why you decided to write about figures like Thatcher, Johnson, and then also British by-elections. Like, what was your decisions in that?
Because you said you openly like Margaret Thatcher, so and it's quite a controversial opinion, especially at the moment, because she's credited with having quite a negative impact even now on the UK.
Yeah, well, you see, that ridiculous comment that you've just made is exactly why I wrote the book, because it is aimed at your generation who have been almost taught that Margaret Thatcher was this evil person who ruined the country. So I've written this short, and it is quite a short biography. It's only 45,000 words, aimed at people who weren't alive when she was Prime Minister, because she left office 35 years ago. And it's incredible, I think, that 35 years on, people still blame her for every ill that affects our economy and our society. And it's just bollocks, basically. So I've written this book which tries to explode a lot of the myths that you will have come to have believed as fact. So I'd like you both to buy the book and read it, because I think you're obviously really politically interested. And I think you'll get a lot out of it. A lot of the books that I do, I edit rather than write. I mean, the Thatcher one, I wrote every word myself. But like the by-elections book, prime ministers, presidents, dictators, kings and queens, I commission somebody to write an essay on each one. And they can be really famous historians, famous politicians, or people like you who are just sort of starting out in the political world, looking to make a name for yourself. So like my LBC producer, Corey, he's written one of the by-election chapters. And I love one of the things that, I mean, if I died tomorrow, one of the things I would like to think that the obituaries would say was that he helped a lot of people in their careers. And if you look at some of the journalists that you see on your TV screens now, started off working for me when I ran Total Politics magazine. Joe Pike, for example, on BBC News, he was my intern at one point. So this is his first job in the media. Look at Grant Tucker, who's the entertainment editor of the Daily Mail. He was my PA for 2 years. And I've got this sort of little group of people who, if they were here, they would at least, I hope they would say that I gave them a start, that I was really encouraging, that I helped them. And again, you see, when I say that, I'm automatically thinking, oh, that's going to sound a bit creepy. Sort of people are going to think, oh, what did he want from them?
It doesn't sound creepy at all.
Well, I hope it doesn't, because I just get a real kick out of seeing people that have worked for me do really well in their careers. And so I mean so these edited books, and the Prime Minister's was the first one, and that did fantastically well, and it's 55 essays on 55 different prime ministers. And of course, I mean, I'm a political geek, but I hadn't heard of some of the ones from the 18th century. So all the essays are between 1,500 words and about 6,000. So like Pitt the Younger, for example, Walpole, Churchill, they get the 5,000 or 6,000 essays. But the Duke of Grafton or the Duke of Newcastle probably get 1,500 words. So it's a really good primer, in a sense, to get a lot of political knowledge, particularly historical knowledge, where you don't have to read a full book. And the intention is to then encourage you, if there's a particular prime minister that you're taken by, then go and buy a full biography of them and read it. And I think a lot of people have done that. So I really, and the thing I enjoy about these books, I generally write one of the essays myself, just to show willing, but I get a real kick out of matching the author with their subject. And sometimes, like famous authors like Simon Heffer, for example, the Telegraph columnist, he will always say, oh, can I do that one? Whereas others say, I don't mind, you just allocate me who you want. And that's usually the younger demographics say that. And the feeling of achievement when you've actually got all 50 slots filled, I really enjoy that. I mean, it's like herding cats, because as you can imagine, getting 50 people to deliver to deadline is not an easy thing. Because I mean, they're not doing it for money, and they do get paid a bit, but it really is only a little bit. And what I've worked out is that there's usually one or two that you've completely misjudged, and they send you something that is not up to par. Well, as the editor of a book, that's quite a challenge to deal with that. There's often one that just doesn't deliver at all and just ghosts you. So you have to then scrabble to find someone to write an emergency chapter. So there are lots of challenges along the way. But I mean, the by-elections book, which comes out next week or the week after, I just got the finished copies of that in. I can brandish it here.
Preview.
And it's like quite
a little teaser.
Very snazzy.
732 pages. So it's
Where
a bit
can
of
you
a
buy that?
doorstop book.
When it's out, where can you buy it?
It comes out on the 18th of September.
Where can you buy it?
Into like a Waterstones.
Well, it's a sort of slightly niche book. I don't know whether every Waterstones will have it. They can certainly order it. You'll be able to get it. Obviously, you can get it now on Amazon. If you want a signed copy, you can get it at politicos.co.uk. That's where all my books are if people want signed copies. And I mean, I don't expect this to be like a bestseller or anything. I mean, the Thatcher book, which was done by Swift Press in June, I mean, that has apparently done really, really well. And it got into.
I saw you talking about it on Trigonometry.
Yeah,
The other day.
I really enjoyed doing that.
I watched a lot of that. It was very good. Yeah,
probably the best. Well, I've done several long form ones. I did one with Ollie Dugmore on Politics Joe. And he got a lot of shit for that because he didn't attack me, which I think a lot of his viewers
God
wanted him
forbid.
to.
Yeah.
But no, I really enjoyed the trigonometry one.
No, it looked like a really good interview, actually. And he's, yeah, no, it was incredible. I need to get that book.
You do.
Just hearing you talk about it.
Yeah, we will.
It'll certainly help me with my my A levels.
And when you've read it, drop me an email and tell me what you thought of it. Genuinely, I'm not trying to solicit you to say, "Oh, it's brilliant." I genuinely want to know.
We're podcasters, Ian. We won't lie to you. Don't worry.
Well, I genuinely want to
critical.
know whether you sort of found it useful, sort of informative, whether it had changed maybe some of your preconceptions, and if you did like it, put a review on Amazon as well, because that always helps.
Yeah, of course.
The main reason, other than being slightly biased because you're here, the main reason I would like to read it is because it's aimed at these misconceptions amongst our age group. Because I've been taught, in education, that Margaret Thatcher is responsible. Why the housing market is so poor at the moment, things like that, and loads of other things. So if you're saying that these are misconceptions, I'm really quite intrigued. So I certainly will. I encourage other people that are listening to also do the same.
Give me a second. So here's the book. The last chapter is called 12 Myths. I could have gone on and done sort of 20 or 30, but I decided 12 was probably enough. So I mean, I'm not going to go into detail on this, but just to give you a flavour, like myth, she supported apartheid in South Africa. I then go on to destroy that myth. Margaret Thatcher believed there was no such thing as society. She did say that, but nobody ever looks at what she said after that or before that. So again, if you look at the paragraphs surrounding that, you come to a bit of a different conclusion. Her role in bringing the Cold War to an end has been exaggerated. Well, in my view, it hasn't. Margaret Thatcher was anti-Europe and would have supported Brexit. Now, this is quite a controversial one because I'm not sure she would have supported Brexit. So, I mean, there are all sorts of things that your generation has been taught to believe, which I just don't believe that if you do the research, like the apartheid in South Africa one, if you do the research, you look at the letters that she wrote, the conversations she had, and of course we can access all of these now through the Margaret Thatcher Foundation website, you come to a very different conclusion. So anyway.
That last one about Brexit is especially interesting because it seems like you're linking it to current day issues. Would you say these historical figures are definitely still relevant then, especially Margaret Thatcher?
I think she is relevant to the modern day in that I think there are a lot of lessons to learn from her period in office. Now, look, this is not a hagiography. This is not me saying that everything she did was brilliant. But if you look at the Thatcher economic settlement, for example, I think that still is relevant to today. But again, your generation will have been taught to believe that all privatizations were failures. Some of them were, absolutely right. Water privatization, which is the one that's in the news at the moment, initially was actually a real success because the reason for water privatization, it wasn't for some dogmatic and ideological reason. It was because our water system was basically hadn't been invested in since the Victorian era. So a lot of the sewers in the country, particularly in London, were effectively collapsing. So in that situation, you need to have a huge amount of money spent on them. And her government concluded that there was no way that the taxpayer was able to fund all of that. So they thought, well, okay, well, let's get it from the private sector. And in the first 10 years of water privatization, there was a huge amount of investment through the private sector in the industry. And it was all going fine up until companies like not hedge funds. Anyway, people like the Macquarie Bank in Australia bought up Thames Water. And instead of ploughing the profits back into renewing the infrastructure, they were hived off for shareholders. And then other companies started to do that. And so that's when there was the slippery slope. Now, that wasn't a failure of privatization. It was a failure of regulation. And you can argue, well, the government should have given Ofwat, the water regulator, more powers. And you'll be absolutely right in that. But the Conservatives weren't in power at that time. The Blair government was in power. And it did nothing to increase the regulation of the water industry. If it had, we might not be in the rather perilous situation that we are today. So it's very easy to sort of say water privatisation has failed. Well, up to a point. And it's the same with the railways, where, I mean, at the time, and I was a consultant on rail privatisation to some of the people that were seeking to buy the franchises. At the time, I thought it was ludicrous to privatise it in the way that the government were doing. And that wasn't her, that was John Major's government, where they separated the infrastructure from the operators. Now, I don't think rail privatisation has failed in the way that many people do, partly because if you look at the number of people travelling by rail now, it's double what it was under British Rail. Double. If you look at the quality of the trains that we have now, I mean, they are mostly, on most lines now, you've got relatively new or brand new trains. Under British Rail, they were like 50 years old. And the problem is that the longer you go on, some people have developed this sort of narrative that, oh, everything was really good under British Rail and it was much better when it was nationalised. I used to commute into London under British Rail and it was a shambles of an organisation. And the idea that civil servants in Whitehall would be better at operating a rail system than rail professionals, to me, is for the birds. But as I say, there are aspects of rail privatisation that haven't worked. But the franchising system did not work. But to say that people always judge these things on their own anecdotal experience. We judge the NHS on whether we've had a good experience with the NHS or not. And I've had a lot of experience with the NHS in the last few years. For me, it's worked really, really well. But other people have had some really bad experiences. So, and that's the challenge for government, to persuade people that they are on the right road and trying to improve and are improving public services. But if you've had a bad experience, you're not going to believe that.
So I think you said this similarly earlier. It's very easy to critique something even when you haven't lived through it. So like I could easily critique British Rail. I never lived through it, so I could say it's fantastic, but I would never know what it's really like. But just a final question from me: what is your biggest piece of advice for someone who's wanting to become either a political candidate or a commentator or a broadcaster? What is your biggest piece of advice to someone who's really wanting to go into one of those fields?
Do something else first. I mean, I think there should be younger people in Parliament. I'm not somebody who thinks it's terrible if you have a 23-year-old MP or whatever, but you don't want you want a sort of smattering of people who've got different life experiences. I mean, I don't believe just because I don't know, 5% of the workforce work in the NHS, that 5% of the workforce, 5% of MPs should have worked in the NHS. I don't think like that. However, I think in most other countries, political careers start when you're in your 40s or 50s. In this country, if you're not in Parliament by the time you're 40, people think, oh, it's not worth bothering. I think that needs to change over time, because age and experience does bring wisdom. And I know that I would be a much better part now at my ripe old age of 63 than I would have done when I first applied to go on the Tory candidates list at the age of 26. What had I done then? I'd been a researcher to an MP for a couple of years after university. I mean, it's ridiculous, very presumptuous of me to think that I should go into Parliament with that kind of experience. So I think, and often when people do go and get other experience, the political bug starts to go away a bit. And it did with me to an extent, but you never quite rid yourself of it. The political virus is still there, latent, waiting to sort of re-emerge. So I think you should be very careful about the subjects you pick to study at university, if you go to university. I mean, not everybody. Again, your generation has been taught to believe that if you don't go to university, you're somehow a failure, and that is so wrong. And you've got to judge, am I going to get, for the debts that I'm going to build up, am I going to get bang for my buck? When I went to university, I had a student grant. All of the tuition fees were paid. There were no loans. And had that not happened, I doubt whether I would have got. I was the first in my family, a bit like Neil Kinnock, the first in my family to go to university. And it was a brilliant 4 years. Absolutely loved it, every minute of it. But I studied German and linguistics. Now, I had intended to be a German teacher, but then politics intervened. So I've done absolutely nothing with my degree at all. And I could speak German so fluently that no German knew I was English. which is, if I tried to draw up a list of my achievements in my life, that would certainly be one of them. It's sadly no longer the case. So I think sort of be careful about what you study at university. Try and make it vocational if you can, but you will get so much more out of university than the studying. I mean, I started a Conservative Association at UEA. This was in 1982. And it was really left-wing university. And I had an absolute ball for the next couple of years, sort of doing that, becoming a notorious figure on the campus, doing student debates on. I remember Caroline Flint, who's the former Labour minister, you'll now see her on Good Morning Britain every Friday. She and I did a debate in the student union on whether VAT should be taken off tampons, which she expected me as a Conservative, obviously sort of misogynist Conservative, to argue that no VAT should be on tampons. And I didn't, because I never like to conform to a stereotype. So it can be great fun, but there has to be a goal at the end of it as to what you think. I mean, at the age of 18, you may think you'll start doing something that you don't end up doing. A lot of people, I think, are fairly decided on the kind of direction their career they want to head in at that age. So there's no point in, I think, just doing a degree for the sake of it. There's got to be a reason for it. So that would be one bit of advice. Just sort of build up political experience, get involved in whatever political party you support, get involved with that at a local level, learn what grassroots politics is all about, get some experience in a career. And then when you feel ready, then go through the selection process.
Well, Iain, thank you so much for your insight today. It's been honestly a privilege to speak to you face to face as opposed to listening to you on LBC as I have done. It's honestly really helped me in my education. So thank you for coming on. It's been a privilege to meet you.
Well,
thank you very much. It's a
thank you
massive
for inviting me. And I mean, I'm delighted to have done it, because I often get emails from parents. Well, I say often, I probably like once every couple of weeks or something. Somebody will send me an email saying, my 14-year-old daughter is interested in politics through listening to you. And I mean, I can't get a bigger compliment than that, because I think part of the problem with politics nowadays is that so many people feel that it's not relevant to them. And it is. It's relevant to everybody, whether you're 14, 40 or 80. And just to think that you can go through your life and not take any interest in politics, I think is a real shame. So, and well done for doing the podcast, because I presume
Thank
most
you.
of
Thank you very
your
much.
audience is your kind of age group.
Yeah, pretty much.
And it's exactly who we're trying to meet. So
Yeah.
no, so thank you for coming on, and hopefully lots of young people listening do listen to LBC, because it's very, very good. I've got a friend who's actually used accredited LBC as why they want to, like you just said, study politics for degree level in his personal statement. So it just goes to show, like, those initial interactions via the radio are so important.
Yeah.
But yeah, Iain,
No,
thank you so
absolutely.
much. It's been a privilege to speak
Thank
to you.
Thank you very much.
All right.